Today we're going to go over some background information that you're going to need as we talk about kelp and kelp forests and different seaweeds as part of our coastal ecosystems unit. And we need to do some background information because kelp belong to a group of organisms that we're probably not as familiar with as you are some other things like plants and bacteria and animals that we've studied in the past. So to begin, I want you to think of key characteristics that makes us able to identify something as a plant or as an animal. So those two groups of organisms are really large, and it's very easy to tell if something is a plant or if something is an animal because we're just used to judging them on some key characteristics. So some things that make a plant a plant are generally they have leaves, they have stems and roots. They're pretty stationary. They grow out the ground. They're sessile. They're green most of the time and do photosynthesis. They don't have as set a structure as animals. So whereas an animal has a certain number of limbs and it either has fur or it doesn't have fur or has scales or has lungs, plants can kind of take on a variety of shapes regardless of their species. So individuals within a species don't have to look as similar as animals do. And then for animals, some things we think of is that they generally move. They are consumers, so they have to eat food to exist, so they have digestive tracts. They have like squishy cells. They don't have as rigid a structure as plants. They're able to move very easily. They communicate and reproduce differently than plants who tend to have seeds. So the way that we judge what type of organism is because they have to meet pretty strict criteria. If something doesn't have roots, it can't be a plant. If something does not have movement or a digestive tract, it might not be an animal. So what we're going to look at today is a third group. There are 5 groups of living things. We're going to look at a third group which doesn't really fit the same criteria as plants and animals. And this group is known as protists. So this is something that we don't tend to study very often outside of marine biology. These are very important organisms to the oceans, but we don't come across them as often on land, so general bio, we don't really cover them. Some background on protists. The scientific term for the group is kingdom Protista. So like I said, there are 5 kind of kingdoms of life. We have the bacteria over here, and then we have protists, plants, fungi, and animals. Key characteristics about them that we will go over. They are eukaryotic. That's a word you should remember from freshman bio. They're paraphyletic, which is a new term we're going to go over. And then what I like about this image here is that it makes it clear that they are species that are similar to plants, similar to animals, and similar to fungus, but they don't clearly fit the criteria. So maybe they're missing a couple characteristics that make it not fit in. So it's kind of similar to the relationship between bacteria and viruses, that they both are infectious, they have similar DNA structures, but viruses are missing some of the components that bacteria have, so they are not bacteria. It's a loose comparison, but if you think about it like that, they're things that just barely miss the requirements to be a plant, animal, or fungus. So starting out, this is a review. I'm not going to test you on all of this information, but if something is a eukaryotic organism, like our protists are and like we are, it means their cells look similar to this guy on the right. They have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, so they are very complicated structures, very complex interactions going on within the cell. They undergo mitosis to grow, so for their cell division. They are larger and more complex than bacteria. So we'll look at a comparison on the next slide. And eukaryotic organisms can be unicellular, so just one cell is the organism, or they can be multicellular, like we are. So they can be made up of interacting cells, all working together within an organism. So just to put it into perspective, the level of simplicity in a prokaryotic cell and a bacteria cell versus a eukaryotic cell, how complex they are. A prokaryotic cell has a membrane filled with ribosomes and DNA. It has a cell wall, and it might have a capsule, like a protective layer on the outside that has the cilia or pili or a flagella that help it move, but it's just a single cell with not much going on inside. Whereas in our cells, we have an animal cell here again, where we have our nucleus and all of our DNA is there, and then we have our endoplasmic reticulum and making our proteins. We have our mitochondria. We have a cytoskeleton to hold everything in place, the Golgi apparatus to make fats and carbohydrates, and all held within a membrane, and we don't have a capsule because these cells have the ability to bond with each other to make up tissues. And then just another review is that from the cell going upwards, cells can form together and form a tissue, which is just a group of cells that are linked. They're the same cell type and they have some function. So we have things like muscle tissue or fat tissue, or layers of our skin are tissue because they all look the same, they all serve the same purpose. Multiple groups of tissues will come together and form our organs. So this here is our liver, which has different layers of tissue within it. Or like our heart, which has muscle, obviously, and then it has some connective tissue and tendons, and blood vessels, which are all different types of tissue, but they all serve one purpose in your body. So your liver is filtering things out of your blood, your heart is pumping your blood, your lungs are taking in oxygen. They all serve one purpose. They come together to form an organ system. Here we have your digestive tract. Hopefully this looks familiar from freshman bio when you had to learn the whole pathway. But these are going to be groups of organs that serve a purpose within the organism. So obviously digestive system is to take in food and release waste. And then all your organ systems are working together to help you survive. So the moral of our story of cellular organization is that we have multiple layers of more complicated structures that are all working independently to do their own function, but then those functions all come together to let an organism carry out its life. Okay, we're going to move to that second word on our characteristics of protists, and that was that they are paraphyletic. This is going to be the most complicated part of this lesson, and it's just something that I want you to know exists. It's not a concept that I need you to master. This is not a concept that you're going to come into contact with very, very often. So it's important to understand how our protists work, but not outside of this unit. So there are two terms that we are going to look at here. There are more than these two terms related to it, but we just need these two. The first is monophyletic. This is a group of organisms that consists of a common ancestor and all of its descendants. This is what we think of as groups of organisms almost all of the time. So when we think of animals as a group, animals are a monophyletic group. There was an ancestor millions of years ago that was the first animal cell, and all animals are going to be closer related to all animals than they are to plants or fungus or bacteria or protists, maybe. So a monophyletic group is just a group where we know that genetically they are all most closely related to each other. So it can be something huge like animals, or it can be something like medium scale. It could be all mammals are more closely related than we are to other animals. It could be really small scale, so something like the panther family, so big cats, so tigers and lions and leopards and jaguars are all more closely related to each other than they are to wolves or bears or any other type of mammal. So that's how you need to know. Mono means one, so it means they had one common ancestor. It's one big group. So they're all closely related to each other, closer than anything else. Paraphyletic is something weird in that it's a group of organisms that has a common ancestor, but we're only grouping some of the descendants together. So what it means is that there are other organisms that are genetically related to them, but we don't group them together. The only reason that paraphyletic groups exist is because humans have grouped them together artificially. So monophyletic groups are an actual evolutionary genetic thing. Paraphyletic is because humans are imperfect in how we group things, how we recognize similarities between things. So they're things that we have decided, they're things we have decided should fit together, but they don't include everyone who is related to them. Like, we exclude some members of a group. So it sounds weird. I'm going to go over some examples that hopefully will make it more understandable, I guess is the term. So monophyletic groups, this is the easy one. So a example here are fish. All fish are more closely related to all the other fish than they are to reptiles, than they are to birds, than they are to mammals. They all had a common fish ancestor, and so now they are closely related. So that could be a big group, it could be a little group here, it could literally be two most closely related things next to each other. So it could be like we are here and chimpanzees are here. We're very closely related, nobody else is as close as us. So it doesn't matter the scale, it just means that if you were to draw out like the tree of life, the genetic tree for how these are related, you would group them together. Paraphyletic groups, we'll start over here on the right with how we would group these things. It just means that somebody who should be in the group was left out for some reason or another. So we can make any number of these things. One that is very obvious, or I guess famous. You know what these animals are. Maybe you didn't know that it was a paraphyletic group, but an artificially made group are reptiles. So reptiles all did descend from a common ancestor, that is true. So dinosaurs and lizards and alligators, turtles should be in here too somewhere, I think over here, they all had a common reptile ancestor, but birds are also descended from that same ancestor. Birds are actually more closely related to alligators than iguanas are, which is just a weird thing to think of. So the reason, or reptiles, are a good example of this for why we might make a paraphyletic group, because birds are obviously like the odd one out in this grouping, in this family of animals. The rest of them all have scales, they all have 4 legs, they all live on land, and birds just went shooting off in their own direction, have feathers, can fly mostly, have wings instead of front limbs. So just because they are genetically closely related, they look very different and they act very different. So before we did the genetic research on it, we as humans did genetic research on them. There was no way of realizing that they were actually in this group. So the term reptiles had already been assigned to things that looked like lizards and turtles and alligators before we knew that birds were the same thing. and birds had been popped out somewhere else by themselves. Okay, so paraphyletic groups are groupings that humans mistakenly made, but they're useful for some reason, generally because the organisms act alike or have some features alike. Okay. So this whole thing is just to bring us into why protists are paraphyletic. We're going to skip over this part because I think I've talked your ear off about paraphyletic, but some examples of like monophyletic groups and paraphyletic groups could be, a monophyletic group could be types of paper. All types of paper, like lined paper and graph paper and printer paper and whatever paper, all has more in common to each other than it does to any other like office supply. I feel like that's a dumb example. But anyway, paraphyletic group could be something like, let's see, maybe desserts. Like desserts, we all group together because we eat them after a meal or they have sugar in them. But like cake probably has more in common than bread than it does with ice cream. They have totally different ingredients, or with fruit, or with whatever else you're going to eat for dessert. So we group them together because of their function, because of some of their characteristics that we see. But if we looked at actual ingredients, we would group everything separately. And ice cream would be with the dairy, and cake would be with the breads, and fruit would be with the produce. Okay. So I left out the key part, is that protists are paraphyletic because, yes, they have a common ancestor, but we have left off some of the other organisms that share that same common ancestor. And the organisms that we're leaving out of the group are plants, animals, and fungus. So protists are just things that barely miss the requirements for one of those groups. So we've grouped them together by default. They're just things that are kind of like plants, or kind of like animals, or kind of like fungus. But they don't have anything else in common. They don't have any further groupings. So there's two types we're going to go over. The first one is algae, which should seem very familiar with us, especially when we're talking about the ocean. This is the whole reason we are studying this right now, is that a large group of protists are called algae. They are just protists that act kind of like plants. They just barely miss the cutoff to be plants. So things they have in common is that they are photosynthetic. They can be unicellular or multicellular. So we're going to look at some unicellular today before we talk about multicellular tomorrow. But one thing they have is that they lack the tissues that define plants. So these are things that all plants have that we would do a lab to get. Well, I'm going to do a lab for this instead of you. All plants have stomata, so we may have done this depending on your grade level in class. They have pores on the bottom of their leaves that let in gases. Obviously, algae that live in the ocean don't need to be letting gases into their tissues because there's no air. And then they have xylem and phloem, which are vascular tissues. Those are things that act like our veins to bring nutrients and to bring water throughout the plant. So this is like those things when you crack open a piece of celery, those fibers there that are the little strings in our food. All plants have them. They're called vascular tissues, just like our vascular tissue, our bloodstream. And they just pump water throughout the plants. So algae, even if they look a lot like plants, things like seaweed that have the same structure as a plant, are not going to have structures like that within them. They're a lot more basic. Here's some examples of those that we aren't going to be able to see but are in seawater all the time. I just want you to appreciate how neat some of these things are and how important they are. So one of them is diatoms. These are my favorite group based on the way they look over here. They are very, very common phytoplankton. They are floating in the top layer of the ocean all the time. They are an important primary producer. They produce most of the world's oxygen. Some things that are interesting about them, the way they look, is they have a silica cell wall. So that's like a glass cell wall, which is why they look so cool here. And they have bilateral symmetry. So any one of them you could cut in half, and just like us, they look the same one side or the other. Some of them also have radial symmetry here, where they're symmetrical in a circular shape, but they at least have one symmetrical, or one line of symmetry that runs through them. A second group that is floating around are called dinoflagellates. They are cells that have two flagella. Flagella are the little structures that act kind of like a tail, but it pushes them along to swim around. So they are capable of movement, whereas diatoms just kind of float there. They are very diverse. They can be free living out in the ocean. They can be parasitic and infect things, or they can be endosymbionts. We are going to come back to these guys when we talk about coral reefs, because these are living inside the tissues of corals and are very necessary for them to survive. Something that's really important about them that we'll talk about a little bit for this unit is they're also the cause of red tide. So not all of them, but some of them cause a thing called red tide, which happens occasionally, especially in warmer waters, is that if there's an overgrowth of these guys, they can release toxins into the water. It can kill fish. It's not safe to go out in the water. There'll be a surf advisory type of thing. They can get into, like, cause neurological issues in some mammals, like sea lions. So there are times that during a bad red tide, the sea lions will get very aggressive because they have poison from this creature, this dinoflagellates. And then the last algae that we're going to look at, the last microalgae that I thought was worth looking at, are called coccolithophores. This is obviously way under a microscope. This is under an electron microscope. These are covered, their cell walls are calcium carbonate plates, so like our bones are made of. And they form these really cool structures on their cell walls. These are really important to us because they are climate change indicators. This is something that we are going to talk about a little bit later, ocean acidification. That one of the impacts of climate change is that our oceans are getting more acidic, or they're lowering their pH, and as you probably know and heard with any health classes, is that acids, or if you watch, I guess, toothpaste commercials, acid is bad for calcium carbonate. It breaks it down and dissolves it. So that's why soda is bad for your teeth. It's why if you put baking soda in vinegar, it blows up. That same thing would happen. So if there are low levels of coccolithophores in the water, it's an indicator that the water has become more acidic because they can't grow or their cell walls have dissolved and they've died. The upside of them is that they also create natural chalk. So when they die, their cell walls remain behind and kind of build up on the ocean floor. And that's what causes like really bright white rock structures. So this is the White Cliffs of Dover on the southern coast of England, and they have these chalk, chalk structures. These are all millions, maybe billions of coccolithophore bodies that have fossilized into this structure. Okay, the second group that we'll look at for our protists are protozoans. These are just unicellular protists that act like animals. So they don't meet the requirements for animals because animals have to be multicellular. We have to be more complex. So these are like almost like miniature animals out there. Some that you have probably heard of before, amoebas fit into this group, so they're capable of moving and they eat things. We've probably seen videos of amoebas eating things or read news articles about amoebas eating people's brains. Don't read those articles if you ever want to go swimming again. And paramecium, which I feel like you also see a lot in science classes. So they're mobile, you'll watch them like move around, they eat things, so they act like animals in that way, but because they're only one cell, they don't count. So an important part here, because this is a paraphyletic group, these protozoans are not actually related that closely to the algae we just looked at. It's only because they don't fit anywhere else that we group them together. Some ones that are in the ocean of note to us are foraminiferans. They're basically amoebas within a shell. So if you think of amoebas like slugs and these like snails, they have the same structure, the same behaviors, except these guys grow a shell to protect them. The shell is called a test. So if you ever see that, there's a lot of types of shells in animals and in other organisms, so they're kind of defined by what type of shell they are. So because it's a thin calcium carbonate shell, that's also sometimes called a test. And their squishy little bodies are within there, and it's covered in these little holes that you can kind of see in this x-ray. And they will pull food, mainly bacteria, out of the water and into their body, but they themselves are protected. The reason these are important is because they have a calcium carbonate shell, they fossilize really well, and so when scientists find these fossils, it can tell a lot about what the environment was like where the organism lived. Within their shell, it will develop differently based on acidity. It kind of shows the ocean currents based on where there are large numbers and where there are fewer. Any solutes that they absorbed into their bodies might be in their bones or in their shells still, just like it would be in our bones. So they're very useful because they have that test. They're also used to locate oil deposits, and I can't go into this because I don't fully understand the concept that well, but based on where the fossils are, it's a good indicator that there is oil underneath that surface. Sorry, I guess because they would live somewhere where there would be a lot of like biological activity, and because oil is made out of organic matter that's been converted to oil. Maybe that's why. The exact science of how they figure it out, I don't remember. The second one, radiolarians. They look kind of neat, so that's one reason that I included them. They also have shells, and they cover a lot of the ocean floor. It's called radiolarian ooze. So we'll see that when we watch like videos from the ocean floor in that like dark zone. This like dusty kind of stuff that looks there, that's actually the shells of these guys. They have needle-like extensions of their body to trap almost like a net, passing food particles that they then pass into their bodies, into the cell to digest. And then our last one are our ciliates. Cilia are these little hair-like appendages on the outside of cells that help something to move, so they'll kind of flutter these and glide throughout the water. We are mentioning them here because they live on the surface of other organisms and can act as a parasite or as like a beneficial symbiote. We'll get to those terms later, but we'll be coming back to some of these things that they can cause some infections on animals that it's good to know that there are other things that infect us besides bacteria and viruses. And ciliates are one of them. Okay, so this was just a general overview of protists. The big things to remember, they are eukaryotic, so their cells act like our cells, but they don't meet criteria to be some of the more complex organisms like plants or animals or fungus, the things that we think of like our larger things that have taken over the earth. These are generally more, I don't want to say archaic, but less evolved organisms, more simplistic, and that's what we'll see when we talk about kelp.